আমাদের দ্বিতীয় অধিবেশন একটি প্যানেল ডিসকাশন সেশন। এই প্যানেল ডিসকাশনে আমাদের তিনজন অতিথি আছেন। Anirban Mukhopadhyay. Anirban is a Ph.D. scholar in communications and media at the Institute of Communications Research College of Media, University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. His current project investigates historical trajectories of broadcasting policies in post-independent India and how these policies shaped radio as a tool of citizenship and nationalism. এই তার বিষয়। আমাদের আরেকজন আছেন, তিনি এই প্যানেল ডিসকাশন সেশন কম্পেয়ার করবেন। Debayudh Chatterjee, Debayudh Chatterjee. Debayudh Chatterjee is a PhD student of the Department of English, University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. His keen interest include Avagada literature, counterculture, progressive politics in India, and critical theory. Debayudh Chatterjee graduated teaching assistant and PhD student, member executive committee, English Graduate Students Association. আমাদের আরেকজন আছেন সৌম্য দাশগুপ্ত। সৌম্য দাশগুপ্ত is a doctoral candidate in architecture, history and theory of the University of Illinois and Urbana, Champaign. He has a master's in urban design from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and Bachelor of Architecture from Indian Institute of Engineering, Science and Technology, Shibpur, Kolkata. His research focus on informal urban practices in the context of post-colonial global South megacities. Soumya is a recipient of the Illinois Distinguished Fellowship. He also works as a teaching assistant for graduate level history and theory courses in architecture. A panel discussion session ke title dewa hoyeche 6 feet apart, city, space and mass media. Over to Debayudh. Debayudh, unmute korte hobe.
Okay, hello, check, yeah. Okay, good morning, Kolkata. This is Debayudh signing in from the Department of English at the University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. It's 1:30 a.m. here, and I am delighted to be invited by a former college where I once upon a time taught for about a year. It's a pleasant experience meeting my old colleagues at the Bangla and the English department across colleges. I see some of my former students here. Thank you guys for joining in.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay, our panel discussion is titled 6 Feet Apart, City Space and Mass Media. For the past few years, or rather, sorry, for the past few months, we have been trying to reflect on how the term 6 feet has acquired a currency which is beyond the literal. It has become a discursive ground where different disciplines are interacting, disciplines which have been affected by the pandemic, and how 6 feet in certain ways stands for a departure from unity and being close to a certain kind of social distancing, which the webinar is all about. Over the past few months, we have noticed that there has been a prominent transition from physical to digital spaces. Most of what we do in our regular life has been moved online, which is why I have an architect who works with history, or a historian who works with architecture, Soumya, who's going to talk about the physical spaces which we have left behind, and Anirban, a scholar in media studies, who's going to talk about how media has acquired a new meaning over the past few months. Okay, so thanks for agreeing to blabbering with me for the next 1 hour, guys. Welcome to the discussion. Anirban, Soumya checking in. Are you guys out there?
Yeah, we're here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and before we begin, I'm just going to apologize on the behalf of all of us
Debayudh,
for.
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I guess all of us are audible, and people across the world can access us. So yeah, uh, before we begin, I'm going to apologize on behalf of all of us for conducting this panel discussion in English at a webinar organized by the Department of Bengali. But we have some of our friends joining in here, and they cannot access our mother tongue, unfortunately. So. For the past 1 hour, our previous speakers have talked about how violence has renewed itself, how neoliberalism has regenerated itself over the course of the pandemic. Now, Shomo, you are a scholar who works on informality, who works on the slums in Kolkata. So I would invite you to speak from your research about how informality has reproduced itself as well. I mean, how the informative sector is coping with the current disaster. Over to you, Shomo.
Hello. Hi, Debayudh. Hi, Anirban. It's great to join here in the panel discussion. And thanks to Debayudh, Militi, and everyone else for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to connect with the city of Kolkata, which I'm missing very much, staying here locked down in my apartment. To start with the question from Debayudh, I think that most of the predominant urban scholarship on megacities in the global south, such as Kolkata, Delhi, Mumbai, we have had a past where we looked at cities from the top down, and that has always been influencing the discourse around informality for a long time. And the other perspective might be to look at the informality from the street level or from the ground level. And if we do that, then in my observation, although my observations are based on anecdotal accounts from my friends whom I connected during this COVID-19 pandemic situation, while it is the fact that the state government and the central government and the lockdown mandate have really put the informal urban practitioners such as slum dwellers, pavement dwellers, street hawkers, and domestic help and other forms of informal practices at a risk. It is also equally important to recognize that the informal urban practitioners have not abandoned their city. In most cases, they could not abandon their city. So my argument is that while yes, it is true that informal urban practices are at risk due to the pandemic situation and the ill-planned lockdown, in particular to India, it is also true that the risk is being subsidized by the informal workers. So as to speak, the reason why urban middle class in India are going through the lockdown in a less riskier way, or rather can afford to work from home, is because their groceries and services and every other modes of requirement in their everyday life are being subsidized by the informal urban workforce. And that has been true before the pandemic as well, but only my observation is that the pandemic has pronounced it even further. So I have heard accounts where rickshawalas and autowalas in Kolkata who were rendered jobless overnight have adapted to this rapidly shifting urban order and they kind of mutated into vegetable vendors and grocery vendors. There has been negotiations outside delivery apps so as to make sure that the delivery people who work through different apps still keep delivering their products to their customers. There has been cases where the ayahs of Kolkata who take care of the senior citizens, and probably many of us can connect to that. Many of us might have a grandmother or a grandfather being taken care of by an ayah. And most of these ayahs, they reside in northeastern, southern, and southeastern fringes of Calcutta and travel by the suburban local train network. And they could not do so because local trains are now not operating. But they rode along with vegetable vendors and tricked the police to come and help the families that they work with. So what I think that my reflections has been in this really rapidly evolving situation, and it's very hard to conclude anything, is that it is also, while it is very much a time to critique the state government and hold it accountable for its ill-planned lockdown as well as the central government, it is also a high time to recognize that the urban middle class is going through this pandemic, definitely taking a lot of risks, but they are putting much more risk on the informal urban practitioners who are kind of, we are basically trading on them to go through this lockdown, and their contributions are quite overwhelming, to be honest. Risking infections and also being forced to be exposed to police brutalities in cases where I've seen some reports where migrant workers and also people who are vegetable vendors are being harassed by police all over India. So that's what can open our eyes to the intrinsic essential nature of informal work in urban scenarios in India. And that would be my primary response to your question, Debayudh. And I guess we can carry on this conversation to Anirban.
Thank you, Shogo, for initiating the discussion in a rather informative way. Yeah, as one of our previous speakers mentioned, the pandemic has taught us a lot of interesting things. Like, you don't need the caste system to perpetuate untouchability. You don't need to build a wall around your country to stop immigrants from entering your nation state. I mean, untouchability, nationalist consciousness, all these have, all these have redefined themselves in the light of the pandemic over the past few months. As the pandemic began, as the number of cases started increasing, we can note two interesting events that happened in India, which kind of share a digital presence as well as a physical presence. Like, 5 baje 5 minute, 9 baje 9 minute. We saw people taking to the streets. We saw recordings of those pervading the space of the media as well. The pandemic happened at a rather interesting historical juncture when there was a vibrant movement going on against several issues, notably the NRC CAA. So Shaheen Bagh became, an abyss of hope, an abyss of resistance, and that was, withdrawn overnight. And there has been a certain increase in the nationalist rhetoric. In fact, in certain ways, the nationalist rhetoric has been bolstered to cover up the failure of the central and the state governments to deal with the lockdown and the country and its citizens. So I'm going to turn to Anirban right now, who's a scholar in media studies, who also works on nationalism and the radio. So Anirban, why don't you enlighten us by saying a few words about the nationalist rhetoric, which has, which has taken over for the past few months, which we have been hearing from the leaders of the state.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Debayudh. Thank you, Professor Samadar, for inviting us for this panel discussion. Thank you, Debayudh, for arranging all this panel notes and everything. Before going into this idea of media nationalism, I will start with some general remarks about how these media narratives are playing out in this pandemic scenario. So, the world historically has seen epidemics before, and the one which is often brought out in different media outlets right now is the 1918 Spanish flu. There is always this historical analogy going on between how the Spanish flu of 1918 played out in the public and the private sphere, and how it's being compared to the present pandemic. Of course, there has been pandemics before, but what is different about this pandemic, as we are living in a media-saturated world which is unprecedented. And this media saturation has been going on for the last 20, 25 years. But I'm very interested in how the dynamics of these media narratives are kind of exacerbated, kind of hyper-realized through at this point, and how this kind of played out in the discourses of nationalism and so on. So the materiality of this pandemic is heavily influenced by media systems and media narratives across different national spaces. When we are going through our social lives, our daily lives during this pandemic, we are also going through the equivalent of a social media pandemic. which is an unstoppable contagion that has sickened our information space, infected our public discourse, and silently and invisibly subverted our political systems. And so the world is sick because American capitalism has been the vector that has brought this infection across the globe. Algorithmically amplified free speech, quote unquote free speech, with no consequences. National governments have very little regulatory power over Facebook or Twitter. And the materiality of social spaces are often produced out of the mediated narratives coming out of the social media. We can actually see violence getting transformed through discourses of WhatsApp. And this has been going on for some time. So I just wanted to make this basic general remarks before going into discourses of media and nationalism. So coming back to the specifics of media and nationalism, when we are talking about media and nationalism, I want to talk about how media narratives in the public and the private spaces manifest the dominant tendencies of the existing political ecology and produces or reproduces national identities, how the media can be seen as an infrastructure which enhances or manifests the power structures of governmentality. And what we are seeing in this pandemic is that the fault lines of the political system and national identity formation are coming out in different ways in the media discourse. One obvious example is how the neoliberal media in India is amplifying the Islamophobic rhetoric. What are the power structures of this narrative? We can question it. And I think it is all about signifying the quote unquote other. The media discourses, the neoliberal media discourses are constructing. Sorry?
I think there's a disruption. May I please request the other members of the meeting here to kind of, mute your speakers and microphones for a few minutes? Okay, I guess we're back to normal. Sorry for the interruption, Anirban.
Oh, sorry, it's okay. So I'm just talking about governmentality and how different discourses of governmentality gets projected and manifested in the neoliberal media discourses. One obvious example is how neoliberal media in India are amplifying the Islamophobic rhetoric. And we can question what are the power structures of this narrative. So I would say it is all about signifying the quote unquote other. The media discourses are constructing which bodies are like a disease to the body of the nation during this pandemic. So we have this disease going on in the public and the private sphere, and the media is projecting or manifesting certain bodies as dangerous or like a disease to the national body politic. So that's the kind of parallel that I wanted to draw. And then there is the xenophobic aspect of the media discourse surrounding this epidemic, which is of course started off by the racializing the virus by saying, oh, this is coming from China. So this must be something related to how the Chinese are trying to dictate terms geopolitically. That discourse is coming out in different ways through different conspiracy theories. So we have already seen that happening. So I wanted to project these points about how media discourses are producing, bringing out different fault lines of the power structure of the existing political system in the public sphere as well as the private sphere. Of course, the public sphere and the private sphere are not mutually exclusive. They are always interconnected and interlocked. But for the sake of analysis, we need to look at them in a different way and look at how the public discourses and the private discourses are being projected through media discourses.
Okay, thank you. I really liked how you pointed out the fault lines in the private and the public discourses. So I'm going to turn to Soumya and ask about the fault lines in the architectural design, the urban planning of a particular city. Like I remember in one of our really long other sessions, which never seem to end, you mentioned how social distancing is rather a geometric impossibility in a city like Kolkata, where the population density is more than what it should be. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more on that.
Yeah, so there are two ways of thinking about it. I think that social distancing, the term is quite confusing. So for an architect and an urban designer, for us, the idea of distance is at once poetic, but very much a literal idea as well. So 6 feet for us literally means 6 feet. And while it has got a larger dimension to the idea of distancing, the physical distancing really affects how city space is perceived and how city space is operationalized to fight the pandemic. So it also shows that this idea of 6 feet distancing, which has been perpetuated, like like Anirban was talking about, with this hyper realized or hyper energized media space, one needs to reflect upon that whether this 6 feet is at all a geometric possibility in one of the most densest urban settings, and many of which are located in India. If you look at the density and the urban layout of places like Dharavi in Mumbai, or Khidirpur Bosti in Kolkata, or Dattabad Bosti next to Salt Lake, uh, would it be possible for people to actually maintain this distancing in their public space and using of the public space? Not to mention, this comes with also looking at the Ministry of Urban Affairs and Ministry of Home Affairs mandate released during the first phase of lockdown, which comes with uh, closing off everything other than the essential quote unquote services. So Indian cities, like in cities like in Kolkata, where 85% of the workforce, according to some estimates from 2016, that 85% of the workforce is employed in the informal sector. And the way the informal sector uses and produces city space, the way the informal sector adds sometimes much fetishized character of Indian urban cities, that spatiality is under high threat if we use the pandemic to kind of expand a regime of making distances between people. Indian cities function, according to urban theorists who are also going through a lot of revisions during the pandemic, due to having a dense urban population. Density is good. That was the understanding in the pre-pandemic scenario. It also provides a lot of secondary benefits like street safety and lack of transportation costs and stuff like that. But I fear that in the post-pandemic scenario, there is a certain anxiety towards distancing. And while that anxiety is legit and it is being understood from the epidemiological perspective, it is also a threat to people who cannot afford to maintain those distances. And the other fear is that in history, whenever we have had pandemic situations, they have been followed by major, like monumental urban renewal projects. And there has been some indications from the UN Habitat regarding that. So they always come with putting the bottom of people at the bottom of the pyramid at risk, dismantling slums and evicting street hawkers and stuff like that. So the biopolitical aspect that both you and Anirban discussed about is that whether we will see a new eviction regime that uses the pandemic as a means to justify eviction and dismantling of informal settlements and informal spaces. What happens to the pavement dwellers of Kolkata in a measure to combat the pandemic? And what are we thinking about then? These are not only design challenges and planning challenges, these are very much social challenges that amplify the violence that is associated with experience of the pandemic. So I think that would be my response. And back to you, Debayudh.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how.
Jump in? Sorry, Debayudh.
Yeah, sure.
So again, Soumya mentioned the idea of biopolitics and how the capitalistic structures kind of take advantage of the pandemic situation and kind of make this biopolitical biopolitical surveillance kind of heightened. Pretty much we see the same thing going on in the mediated discourses, that the biopolitical are being projected onto a certain group of people. Please, sorry.
Yeah. Well, that's totally all right. I mean, you guys brought up some really fascinating points, which I'm going to try and wrap my head around for a moment. You mentioned how, this geometrical impossibility of social distancing has initiated a certain kind of violence, and the poorest of the poor, the wretched of the earth, to quote Frantz Fanon, are at the receiving end of it. And as we have been talking about, for the past few months, the media is playing a seminal role in shaping public consciousness, because that's all you have. Like, you're sitting in your home, you have an Android, a laptop, a television, and that just becomes your gateway to the rest of the world. And overnight, the duty of the media has seemed to increase, because all the schools and colleges have closed down, the newspaper outlets and the TV channels have not. So, the ethics of the media the ethics of the media deserve more attention and interrogation than ever before. So, okay, so I want Anirban, I want Anirban to speak on it for a minute. If you could, link that with your research and maybe talk about what the media should do and what it has actually done.
Well, I have what I'm observing in this situation is that, of course, there are different layers of media, like the semi-official media in different national sphere, the semi-official media, official media, and there is the neoliberal private media, and there is the private, so-called private sphere, private media ecology of Facebook and WhatsApp and so on. So these different layers of media kind of projects a certain mediated discourses about what's the national space is, how the national space is being produced. So I will point to a couple of narratives which I think is really interesting, especially to me. One is this notion that this mediated narrative during the pandemic is all about infodemic. So when I talk about, use the term infodemic, which is about, what I'm pointing to is creation of all sorts of conspiracy theories about how this virus is spreading, who's responsible for making this virus, and so on and so forth. So that, what it does, it creates this straw man or woman who can be kind of completely debunked through certain discourses. And it becomes easier for the political systems to kind of demonize, so to say, certain groups of people. So that's the infodemic part of it. And mostly the semi-official trolls in social media does this kind of work, that producing that demonization of certain groups of people. And that produces certain social spaces. And that social space is kind of manifests itself in the material space also. Material space through urban violence. We can mention the riots that happened in Delhi. That is, of course, part of it, the Islamophobia that media discourses projected also. Also, the idea of surveillance, that how now it's becoming easier for the national governments to use mediated discourses to surveil people in different spheres. Also, the way the neoliberal media kind of plays its role during the pandemic is kind of produces kind of a spectacular discourse. It's all about the spectacle of who we are and what we should be doing in this situation. So it's a kind of in sensationalizing all these ideas about identities and so on and so forth. So that's the main thing that is going on, that the spectacle of the media that is being projected, which kind of affects certain discourses within the national sphere. So it's about affectation and spectacle that is happening through media discourses right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm rather intrigued by how you connected the relationship of the physical space and the digital space, which is manifesting in the form of media, and how it's using spectacle, so to say, to, maybe bolster its business, maybe to, carry forward whatever agenda that it has, and telling what the nation needs to know and doesn't need to know. And, all that rhetoric that has been happening. Uh, Over the past few months, along with the pandemic, there are several interesting events which happened worldwide. For instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, which garnered momentum in the US and spread like wildfire across the globe. There has been environmental hazards like Amphan, like Kolkata not only has to deal with the pandemic, but also with Amphan, like there have been floods in Bihar, in Assam, which the media seem to have neglected. So a lot of, unfortunate events are happening. And in certain ways, the pandemic has posed a barrier to address those problems in a way they should have. And as Shoma pointed out just a few minutes ago, that the informal sector is the biggest victim. So, I mean, like on the one hand, we have a pandemic, on the other hand, we have a cyclone. Shoma, your work is on a slum which is at the margins of, within quotes, a civilized urban space. I want to ask you right now, what are the limits of the informal sector in coping with the pandemic? Like, you could talk about how it's affecting your research. And secondly, how do you think, the other problems, especially the environmental hazards, have aggravated the crisis of the informal sector, especially the slums, most of which have been destroyed by the cyclone? Over to you, Shoma.
Yeah, so there is, I don't want to intellectualize the slum too much here, because it sometimes we might want to think that the slum structures or the particular slum settlements that we look at and observe, along with the pavement dwelling settlements, which are of a different type, um, that they seem to us as temporary structures. But what has been true since the mid 19th century industrial towns in England and Paris and New York and all the major cities, they've always had slums. So the pre-postmodern discourse, if I may call it that, has been mostly kind of a Marxist understanding of slums as spaces of exploited labor. However, even in the post-colonial 21st century globalized global south, we see a lot of slums, and they have been there through different regimes of eviction, different political projects of dismantling them, different aesthetic projects of making them look ugly or undesirable for a beautiful city, and honestly, through different calamities which might be natural or man-made, including fire hazards and fires and floods and cyclones. Now we have to look a little beyond the city to understand how slums come into play. In India, particularly, most cities like let's say Delhi or Calcutta are also surrounded by a huge and densely populated rural hinterland. And the rural-urban influx has been a continuous thing that has been happening since India started urbanizing. And so the point is that the slums have this tendency to reproduce themselves. And what most institutional planning practices, I use the word institutional carefully, because there are radical planning practices which are counter to the institutional planning practices in a way. Most planning practices kind of try to make a city that makes slums invisible, slums undesirable, and if possible, dismantled and redeveloped elsewhere. Most slum redevelopment projects have not worked out in Indian context. And the reason is, I think, one of the main reasons is the huge population of the informal sector. The primary tendency from a theoretical perspective might be to see the informal sector as the counter to what state can provide. But it is also the fact that the existence of the informal sector and its very nature of being informal subsidizes most of the labor going into urban production. So the not having a contract or having a casual relationship, not having protection of wages, not having um, uh, health insurance benefits or anything for that matter, which is available to the formal sector, makes it possible for Indian cities to function. So the question is quite opposite. It's not what informal sector, for me, it's not what is the limit of the informal sector, but rather what is the limit of the Indian city without the informal sector. Now, I think personally, given that, just looking at numbers, given that a huge percentage of Indian cities' urban spatial productions are done by the informal workers, not the buildings and the spaces, but how the city actually functions. Uh, can Indian cities actually work without its informal sector? Will it be possible to have Calcutta without its street hawkers? Will it be possible to have a middle class Calcutta household without the domestic help, without the rickshawalas, without the massive informal sector that subsidizes these lifestyles? So I think it would be prudent for us to not only recognize the limitations of the state in trying to provide for the informal sector, or it's rather in this particular scenario, it's apathy towards the informal workers, but also to realize that Indian cities in a way they cannot function rather without their essential, the idea of the essential services is quite restricted, I think. So we need to expand that and understand the essential nature of how Indian urban settings perform. And definitely to address the question directly, not everything can be done from a position of marginalization. But at the same time, there is a potential in recognizing and articulating those practices, so as to see what happens in the post-pandemic city would be interesting, but we cannot do so without first recognizing that most of the Indian city is made by its informal workforce.
Okay, it's it's noteworthy how you kind of said that a city is incomplete without its informal sector, and how in a way the slum defines the city more than how the city defines the slum. And I think we have a rather crucial point of inquiry here. The city, as you said, is a site of many discourses. It is also the site of dissent. I referred to Shaheen Bagh right at the beginning of the panel discussion, how it kind of was withdrawn overnight as a precaution against the pandemic. And what we have seen is how dissent has been transplanted solely on the digital space. Like, Twitter is trending more hashtags than ever. Like, for the past few weeks, we have seen a lot of academics being arrested without a fair trial, without proper evidence. The academics, poets, they're like behind bars. Social activists, feminists, they're being picked up. And most of the protest is happening online. Most of the protest is happening online. And I think I can, cite a few theorists here, especially Asif Bayat, who talks about a revolution without revolutionaries, who, refers to, who has worked extensively on, Twitter as a medium of dissent, the limits of it, the potentials of it, and so on and so forth. So, Anirban, you were talking about the media as a spectacle. Do you think the media makes these protests appear as spectacles as well? Spectacles that will not longer, that will not long last, that will not last longer than 15 minutes?
I don't think I think spectacles are going to continue. So you mentioned how new spaces of dissent have opened up, and it's a privileged form of dissent, right? Those of us who have the access to high-speed internet, who have the tools to produce the discourses of dissent. We are in an interlock crisis. We see the racial protest happening in US, the economic downturn because of the pandemic. And this internet crisis have forced certain media discourses to bring out the discourses which are regularly erased in our consciousness, like discourses of race, class, gender, and caste, and so on. Partho Chatterjee, Professor Partho Chatterjee, one recent interview said that in Bengal, the internalization of caste is so complete that we don't see those discourses coming out in the media. But since this pandemic is kind of making those fault lines visible, whether we want it or not, then the media has to kind of project or manifest certain narratives about how these discrepancies are playing out. And talking about the spaces of dissent, we have also seen different forms of dissent playing out in actual physical space. And actual physical space is also not disconnected from the mediated space, because even though some marginalized people don't have access to digital sphere, they still get influenced by some kind of opinion leaders, because these opinion leaders kind of percolate those information to that marginalized space. So the marginalized space, although it doesn't have the privilege of the digital discourse, they still get influenced in a sense that how these two spaces get connected. So spaces of dissent, as I see it, are the spaces of spectacle, if you want to call it. These are taking shape through certain, these have their own ups and downs. And basically what I see is the spectacle is taking precedence. So we don't see the resistances of the margins in the mainstream media discourses.
Yeah,
So
I'll pick up from where you left off. I rather liked how you wonderfully summed up, how, these spaces are incomplete without each other. And I think we need to start winding up. I guess we have something around 15 more minutes. So here's an announcement for the listeners. If you have any questions to any of the speakers, write them in the chat box. I'm going to pick them up and ask them on your behalf. And I'm sorry, I don't think we can take too many questions because we're going to run out of time. So feel free to look us up on the UIUC website. Our email IDs are available, and you're encouraged to write to us. So yeah, but let's get back to the panel discussion here. So, the digital space is not going to last forever. Someday or the other, the pandemic's going to end, and we are going to be reclaiming physical spaces, once again. So Shomo, what do you think the challenges of an architect could be here? Like, do you think you guys need to build housing complexes which can protect you against the pandemic like they protect against an earthquake? Do you think we're going to have like gigantic classrooms where, the students are going to be seated 6 feet apart? So, how do you reflect on that, as an architect who works with history and a historian who works with architecture?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think that first, to respond to the first part of your comment, is that physical spaces are essential for social practice, and they complement each other in many ways. So physical spaces are essential to being human for us, and we have always been in space physically. And architecturally as well. So the architect's job is to basically design the canvas on which the physical manifestations of whatever the urban practice is that happens. That can be designing the Durga Puja pandal to designing museums. It's all about creating that physical formal infrastructure within which social space produces itself. Now, to take account of the pandemic, I think it is too early to say, but at the same time, one thing that is happening is that this particular, I think, phobia towards the outside and the flattening of our space to the 2D screens of our laptops and mobile devices. The universities have taken up, in the context of the United States, some has taken up fully transforming their education fully online. Some universities have taken the hybrid mode of delivering education. And that kind of takes away, and I mean, honestly, I feel a little worried about students who are getting admitted to different programs in the United States in 2020. That and also across India, I mean, there is the digital divide aspect, which Anirban already talked about. The idea that the physical space will flattened to a digital space is a very uh, it's a very problematic idea, and I think that essentially takes out the jobs of the architects, to be honest. But at the same time, it is also necessary for us to acknowledge that if there is a vaccine, I mean, talking in very practical terms, if there is a vaccine that, according to some estimates, might be operationalized at a large scale in mid of 2021, some are optimistic and that it will come in the early 2021. It might come from India, it might come from UK, it might come from United States. I don't know, but if vaccination is successful and we mitigate this, it will be easier for us to return to business as usual. But at the same time, there will be small scale changes in how spaces behave. Any architecture studio that will open up in fall or in India, in US, they will have the new question about how do you design keeping pandemic in mind, and how that will change, especially public places and public spaces, institutional spaces as well, and as well as residences. But what will be the direct changes in the typology of those spaces as they are designed? I think that the pandemic might have a significant, the pandemic might influence it significantly, but at the same time, they are mostly shaped by real estate interest in context of most cities across the world. So I really do not know what will happen, but at the same time, what worries me more is the flattening of the space to the digital encounter. I've been taking classes for the last few months and talking with my advisors and other friends, sitting in front of my laptop, and the entire experience of going to a classroom, to a seminar, to the library, to the public places, to a restaurant or a bar, that has been kind of taken away. And basically the architectural space is being taken away, or the public architectural space is taken away, and you're constrained within the four walls of your house or home, and those of us who have a home, to be honest. So that's my mixed reaction to your question. I really hope the vaccine comes out and things get better and architects get on track by building cities and all in a more empathic and more sensible way that is inclusive. Not, I mean, there is something to be learned for every discipline, and we should learn those carefully.
Okay, I'm going to pick up from there. Thanks, Romo. I'm glad how you touched upon how the idea of the university is changing. I mean, of course, we're going to agree upon the fact that COVID-19 has reaffirmed and reinforced class, caste, gender, racial, different kinds of differences, and therefore brought about discrimination. But on the one hand, since your living room has become your new world, it's your university now, it's your pub now, it's your, chayat dokan now, whatever. I mean, the idea of the university has undergone a radical transformation over the past 3 months. Like, you don't need to go to a physical library anymore. You can access digital copies on the library website. If you are in a privileged space, which has a library which can afford to digitalize, you don't need to go to the classroom. You can just switch on to Zoom or Google Meet or whatever the app might be. And, so on the one hand, you do need a fast internet connection, which so many people across the globe cannot access. On the other hand, in certain ways, education or knowledge has been democratized. Like, you can sit in Howrah and, probably log into a class at Harvard, maybe listen to a free lecture at Princeton. So Anirban, do you want to comment on that? Do you want to talk about how the idea of the university has so rapidly changed for the, to kind of meet current dispensations?
Sure. I mean, what is happening right now is, the scary part is few big technology companies kind of control all the infrastructure in universities. well, not just in universities, in every kind of social sphere. And some of the geopolitical aspects of it, very few governments have much control over those big technology companies. And what is happening in universities is certain sections of the university is pushing for more technological reformation, that so that we don't, even though we are kind of going back to some semblance of normalcy in near future, some people will say that we still need more enhanced technology. So we don't have to have more human interaction, because this precarious virus have shown that pandemics might come up again, and university spaces can become very dangerous precarious spaces. So that one aspect, that very pessimistic thing, that universities are going to shrink as human space of interaction. But then the question comes, how is it even possible to do humanistic studies when we have lesser amount of human interaction within the university spaces? So what I see is it's becoming a more hybrid space in the university, especially in US, where we have the digital privilege to most of the university students. So universities are going to be less of a human interaction. That's a pessimistic thought, but that's how I look at it, that even though some normalcy is coming back, there is going to be lesser human interaction in the university spaces.
I think that's a rather interesting conundrum. I mean, how could we have humanities without human interaction? And if human interaction happens on a digital space, I mean, it's like, what they call in Bangla, dute shad khole metano, or maybe, it's incomplete in certain ways. So I'm going to wrap up the discussion by asking one final question, a common question to both of you, because both of you engage with neoliberalism in different ways, in your research. So Soumya and Anirban, a common question to both of you. Do you think, there have been studies, very recent studies though, and studies which refer back to studies done ages ago, that the Black Death kind of ended feudalism in Europe. The Spanish flu, something that happened 100 years ago, about 100 years ago in Europe, brought about radical transformations in the political dispensation, affecting the economy and the sociology of Europe. So do you think the pandemic is going to strike a dead blow to neoliberalism, as many are predicting and hoping, and if I may use the word, dreaming or imagining?
Shomo, would you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I would say that is mostly a dream as of now. And that would be a good dream to have. Although I don't think the pandemic is enough to take down neoliberalism at the same time. I honestly, reading several scholars across disciplines who have talked about neoliberalism, it's very difficult to understand what it exactly is. There have been so many theories from geography, from urban planning, talking about it, but it's the very difficulty lies in the fact that it's difficult to comprehend fully. But I do suspect that some scholars might, some arguments might be that the pandemic is giving a blow to the neoliberalism. The very nature of neoliberalism is to take that blow and reproduce it back, and regenerate itself over and over again. So we might see a shift in how capitalism functions, and we might call it a newism, the post-pandemic neoliberalism. But I don't know how it will look like, but I don't think that only the pandemic crisis would be effective enough to take down the neoliberalism on its own. And it might be one way of killing one evil with the other, but it needs concerted efforts of dissent, critically poised dissent, and awareness about this larger evil that we identify as neoliberalism. And I think that would be the direction I would think on. And I guess Anirban can respond to it.
I think you answered the question rather succinctly. So I'm just going to pick up from there and rephrase the same question a bit differently to Anirban here. The three of us are non-immigrant, non-resident aliens. If I use the official jargon, residing in the US, doing our research, negotiating and grappling with neoliberalism in different ways. And, some way or the other, as you pointed out, neoliberalism has the power to absorb whatever that challenges it. Che Guevara, like the best example being T-shirts of Che Guevara, like which the neoliberal franchises are marketing across the globe. Like, KFC, which sells food at a cheaper rate than a traditional restaurant in a city like Kolkata. So, as you pointed out, neoliberalism is a cat with 9 lives. One single blow will not kill it. Anirban, do you think this is an occasion where, the certain kind of fascist communal tendencies which we have seen consolidating across the globe for the past few years, do you think the pandemic has given an opportunity for them to consolidate even more? I mean,
absolutely. The authoritarian tendencies are becoming even more demonic. That absolutely. And Shomo just pointed out that neoliberalism has this power to regenerate and reproduce. And I was thinking of how Antonio Gramsci talks about hegemony, right? If we look at neoliberal structure as a form of hegemonic infrastructure, then Gramsci also talks about historical moments of hegemony. And I see this pandemic or crisis as a hegemonic historic moment. And neoliberalism has the power to co-opt, but at the same time, I'm kind of hopeful looking at all the protests coming out of, for example, Black Lives Matter, or similar kind of protests across the globe, climate change, for example. And the pandemic, this lockdown has given that opportunity for people to kind of get entrenched in their homes and think about certain aspects of how their lives are changing. So there are forms of resistance, or people are kind of carving out, different groups are carving out different spaces of resistance. But I'm sort of pessimistic about how neoliberalism can be dismantled through this pandemic. I think it's more of a Gramscian aspect of hegemonic moment of crisis.
Well, this is the worst of times. This is the best of times. We have been confined to our homes, but it has given us ample of opportunities to reflect on not just ourselves, but the rest of the world. So I think it's better to end on a note of promise. I think something better is going to come out of it. Today, tomorrow, maybe day after tomorrow, but sometime. So we have a question here. If you guys look at the chat box, data. Slums represent about 18% of the containment zones in Kolkata and 0% of the zones right now. Number 2, 30% of the population of Kolkata are in slums. How do we wrap our head around this counterintuitive phenomena given how difficult distancing is in slums? And I guess, there are some more politically charged question that follows up. And why is the media fetishist about slums being hotspots in Kolkata? The data says otherwise. Okay, so I want Shomo to answer the first part of the question and Anirban to answer the second part of the question. Are you guys fine with it, or do you want to?
Let me clarify the question. Yeah. Sorry, Shomo. So the second time,
no, go ahead.
They're asking that media is fetishizing slums. Is that the question?
Yeah, I mean, if you guys could just look up the chat box, which should be on the right of the screen.
Yeah, I'm looking at the question right now, yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, the media fetishizing slums about being hotspots in Kolkata, I think it kind of,
It says otherwise, okay, right, okay.
Right. Okay, Anirban, you want to go at it, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of linked to Anirban's question, Anirban's observation about media being a spectacle. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's why my answer is going to be. Right?
I think this is a really important, it's a wonderful question to start with. And the point is, for me right now, looking at the question, I think the second question is kind of fits into the answer of the first one in a way. The point is that the informal, so firstly, we need to make sure that we understand three things separately. One is the informal urban practices or urban informality, then informal settlements, and then slums. And there are registered and unregistered slums in Kolkata. And I don't have the numbers at my hand right now, but the point is that understanding slums as spaces of informality is one thing, and understanding slums as part of distinct wards and containment zones are different, because slum dwellers do not only live in slums, they work in the formal city around them. So containing them within the zone can give us certain quantitative understanding of how much the slum is, which in case, I guess, the 18% of the containment zone is coming from that understanding. But the understanding that the informality is kind of spread across the city space will give us the deeper understanding of the mobility within the informal sector. I personally am very cynical before the data that is being presented from India. So we need to make sure that that data is understood, along with understanding that testing facilities and reporting of data are always, I mean, in the United States as well, but even more so in India, that those data, we cannot take them blindly. And there are a lot of politics behind how that data is used and represented to us through media. And I think Anirban can expand upon that, the problematics of data and how media utilizes it to build a certain narrative.
Yeah, I have already talked about that spectacle, how the media kind of sensationalizes the other. So they have to sense, there is an economic kind of necessity for media to do this, because ultimately they have to sell their product. So there is this economic necessity for the neoliberal media to fetishize and sensationalize in whatever way they can. That is one part of it. Other part of it, of course, is there is this media kind of follows certain tendencies of the political system. So right now, what we see, there are authoritarian tendencies within the political sphere. And so there always this kind of necessity to produce certain other, quote unquote other. The undesirable bodies, or kind of bodies which can be taken out of the social sphere. So these are dangerous narratives, really. And one implicit narrative which is kind of embedded in these narratives is, then why don't we just kill these other bodies? Why don't we exterminate them? So it is a very fascistic sort of tendency going on.
I mean, you do not need to exterminate physically, but simply invisibilize them. Like that's
right,
what we have
noticed, right, exactly.
The migrant workers, the victims affected by the floods and cyclones, they have had hardly any media presence. Okay, so there's another question from my former colleague and friend Tathagata, which is directly addressed to Soumya. Soumya, can you see the question in the chat box, or do you want me to read it out to you?
Yes, I think that the question is quite interesting, and modern architecture, I think, is very unfriendly in crowded cities like Kolkata. The Gari Baranda or rock has disappeared, where people could take shelter for a while. Will the pandemic make architecture even more exclusive and hostile? And thanks for the question, Mr. Shen. I think it really reminds me of Kolkata very much sitting here. But the point is that Gari Baranda and rock has been a component mostly in North Calcutta area. It's not that much present in south of Baliganj. There might be exceptions, because Kolkata is a city I shall be keeping exploring for my life. But mostly rocks and Gari Barandas are present in the older fabrics of the city. It might be difficult to find them in places like Rajarhat or Salt Lake. as well. The point is, and that kind of justifies how modern architecture, or shall I say, the modern capitalist architecture, to be honest, because again, modern architecture we can understand as a movement, and we can also understand as a thought process. But if we look, what we identify as modern architecture definitely kind of erases most of these places, which become an interaction space between the formal and the informal, and they help in formalizing the city. So the rock culture in Calcutta gets appropriated to an extent in modern places like the Salt Lake City Center. But again, connecting it to post-pandemic architectural response is also quite challenging. But I think that there's two things at play here. One, this phobia of congregating together in a space. The other is the very kind of vibrant practice of informality in Kolkata's streets, and these forces will negotiate with each other, I guess. And neither, I don't know which one will win, but definitely from a neoliberal perspective, from real estate driven interests and architectural practices that carry forward those interests, we will see using the pandemic to probably justify further why the public congregation spaces needs to be kind of sanitized and removed and erased in various design through various design agendas, and that's like I think that it will make it more exclusive and hostile, to be honest. But then the resistance is in the informal practice around those architectural spaces that the city of Calcutta is full with. So in every other new node, you will find an auto stand, and next to the auto stand, you will find a chai dukan. And these are not planned in the master plans. So those processes are equally important in our experience of the architecture that we look at.
All right, it's 2:30 a.m. in Urbana, Champaign, and 1 p.m. in Kolkata, which means it's time for your lunch and it's time for us to go to sleep. It was really, it was really nice having Soumya and Anirban over the past 1 hour. We talked about how the physical space and the digital space often complement and often are in conflict with each other, and how those complements and how those conflicts have been transformed over the past few months in the light of the pandemic. Thank you again, Bhawanipur Education Society College, for inviting the three of us. It has been, personal pleasure for me to go back to an institution, digitally though, where I taught. And I'm really happy to have my friends associate with the institution over this event. Thank you, Melody. Thank you, BESC. Thank you, everyone, for attending our session, for bearing with us for 1 hour. So I guess I'll end here. Thank you very much.
ধন্যবাদ অনির্বাণ মুখোপাধ্যায়, দেবায়ুধ চ্যাটার্জি এবং সৌম্য দাশগুপ্ত। ওয়ান্ডারফুল সেশন, সত্যি খুব খুব ভালো লাগলো আমাদের এরকম একটা সেশন অ্যাটেন্ড করতে পেরে, এরকম একটা সেশন ইনভাইট করতে পেরে খুব ভালো লেগেছে। আমার মনে হয় তথাগতদা আছে। তথাগতদা, তুমি কি আছো? তথাগতদা, তুমি আমাদের I.Q.A.C কোঅর্ডিনেটরও, আর তুমি প্লিজ যদি একটা থ্যাঙ্কস গিভেন কিছু বলো, হ্যাঁ, একটু ধন্যবাদ জানিয়ে দাও যদি।
যাই হোক, সত্যি খুব ভালো লাগলো, বিভিন্ন দৃষ্টিকোণ থেকে জানতে পারলাম। আমার একটাই দুঃখ, সৌম্যকে বলছি, যে কলকাতার যে নিজস্ব চরিত্রটা সেটা হারিয়ে যাচ্ছে। রাজারহাটের ফ্ল্যাটের সঙ্গে গুড়গাঁওয়ের ফ্ল্যাটের কোনো তফাৎ নেই। আমরা কলকাতাকে আগে যেমন কলকাতা হিসেবে চিনতে পারতাম, there is no distinct identity now. I think কিরকম একটা একরকম সবকিছু একটা ইউনিফর্মিটি এনে দিচ্ছে, সেটাই আমাদের মনে হচ্ছে একটা লস। এনিওয়ে, যাই হোক, চেঞ্জ তো করবেই। ঠিক আছে, ধন্যবাদ সবাই।
ধন্যবাদ।
না, আমি মনে করি যেটা খুবই একটা দুঃখজনক ব্যাপার তো বটেই, এবং বড় হয়েছি কলকাতা শহরে, 23 বছর বয়স অব্দি কলকাতাতেই ছিলাম। তো এবার এই রাজারহাট বা নিউ টাউনের মতো এরিয়া, এই জায়গাগুলোর আর্কিটেকচার ডেফিনেটলি হ্যাজ নো রেমিনিসেন্স, মানে এটাকে ঐতিহাসিক দিকে নজর রেখে বানানো হচ্ছে তা নয়। আবার এট দ্য সেম টাইম কলকাতার ইনফর্মাল এক্সপেনশন যেদিকে হচ্ছে, ধরুন আপনার মানে কলকাতার দক্ষিণ দিকে একদিকে যদি আমি রাজশাহী মিউনিসিপ্যালিটিটা দেখি, অন্যদিকে যদি আমি ডায়মন্ড হারবার বা জোসা পেরিয়ে দেখি, তখন আমি দেখবো যে সেখানে কিন্তু অতটা প্ল্যান ডেভেলপমেন্ট নয়। এবার উত্তর কলকাতার যে চরিত্র, সেই চরিত্র তৈরি হতে মানে কয়েকটা জেনারেশন লাগবে যদি তার করবার স্পেস আমরা দিই। এই চরিত্র তো ডিরেক্টলি রিক্রিয়েট করা সম্ভব না। তো আমার মনে হয় যে মানে অরিজিনাল কলকাতার চরিত্রটাকে রিপ্রোডিউস করা একটা ম্যাসিভ ডিজাইন চ্যালেঞ্জ। কারণ বিগত 100 বছরের আর্কিটেকচার এবং আরবান প্ল্যানিং এর স্টাডি কলকাতা কেন্দ্রিক নয়। সেই স্টাডিগুলো মূলত আমেরিকা কেন্দ্রিক এবং ইউরোপ কেন্দ্রিক, এবং সেগুলো মানে পোস্ট ইন্ডিপেন্ডেন্স পিরিয়ডে নেহেরুর মডার্নিস্ট মুভমেন্ট বলুন বা 90s এর পরে ওপেন লিবারাল গ্লোবালাইজ ইকোনমি বলুন, ওইগুলোকে ওই মডেলগুলোকে আমরা ইম্পোর্ট করে বসানোর চেষ্টা করছি কলকাতার মতো শহরে, দিল্লির মতো শহরে। এবং মানে ধরুন গুরগাঁও বা নয়ডার সাথে ওল্ড দিল্লির যে খুব একটা সামঞ্জস্য আছে তা না, বা নবী মুম্বাই আর নয়ডার মধ্যে খুব একটা ডিফারেন্স নেই। এটা খুব বড় একটা ডিবেট, এবং মানে এটা ওয়ান অফ দ্য মেইন স্ট্রাগলস অফ architecture historians about what is the idea of heritage and how we preserve it, and urban historians as well. তবে মানে কলকাতা শহরের চরিত্র যেমন একদিকে হারিয়ে যাচ্ছে, তেমনি অন্যদিকে সেটা রিপ্রোডিউস হচ্ছে না। ওইগুলোর দিকে নজর দিলে আমরা হয়তো কোথাও গিয়ে কলকাতাকে একটু বাঁচাতে পারবো বলে আমার মনে হয়।
ধন্যবাদ।
ধন্যবাদ সৌম্য। আমাদের প্রথম সেশনে যারা আমাদের অতিথি ছিলেন মাননীয় মমতা রায়চৌধুরী এবং মাননীয় দেবাশিস মজুমদার, আপনারা কি কেউ আছেন উপস্থিত এখানে? নেই মনে হয়। আমরা আজকে সেশন শেষ করছি। অংশগ্রহণকারী সবাইকে আমাদের আন্তরিক শুভেচ্ছা জানাই। আমরা আবার আগামীকাল সকাল 10:30টায় এই নতুন আরেকটি অধিবেশনের জন্য প্রস্তুতি নেব। আপনাদের উপস্থিতি আমাদের ভালো লাগে। ধন্যবাদ।